grateful for all the hands that supported me in this project and have brought me here to you today. My name is Kaitlin Young, and I will be reading from my poetic statement and sharing visuals from my thesis, We, Me. We moved into the house on Beacon Hill in July after my boyfriend Mike purchased it with the help of his mother. Over the last few years, she has dedicated considerable time to fulfilling her late husband's bucket list, which included buying a house in Seattle, a dream he died before seeing to fruition. Mike and I had each been living in separate one-bedroom apartments, and we have similar taste, so it seemed like we could each move our things into this new three-bedroom house and have plenty of room to grow. But it was more complicated than that. For one thing, the couple that sold the house was divorcing. Alice is a doctor, Maurice is an artist, woodworker, and stay-at-home dad. They have 2 boys and are nearing their teens. Even now, the Google Street View of the house shows their eldest son leaving our front steps on a skateboard. Alice and Maurice had been living in the house for 15 years, and their lives were so seeped into the property that perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised when, on moving day, the house appeared to be empty, but in almost every drawer or closet, something had been left behind. It was like the dust of their lives had collected in the corners. In the basement, it lay in piles. They had left many boxes and storage bins. We found old pictures of the couple, sketches and drawings from Maurice's art school days, and even their wedding invitation. After we moved in, Maurice called and set up a time to pick up his things. He took 1 truckload, but didn't come back for the rest. On top of the belongings from our own apartments and what was left behind by Maurice and Alice, Mike's mother sent up a U-Haul truck filled with furniture and boxes from both her sisters and her own house. All of a sudden, we were jammed into our new space, and it was less like we had moved into a home and more like we had moved in on top of the family that had been there before. It was as though we had layered our lives on the history of the house. Once we were able to find places for most of the things we had brought into the house, we began to filter through the things that Maurice and Alice hadn't taken on their last trips. We found bins of Legos, boxes of house paint, and lots of tools. Tucked away in a dark corner was a dollhouse. It must have belonged to Alice. It is too faded to have belonged to one of the boys, and the color of the mock furnishings, burgundy and brown, allude to an artifact that was created in the 1970s. The dollhouse is not in good shape, and oddly, a lot of the needed repairs resemble those required by our own house. Part of the roof is torn off, mimicking our roof that needs to be replaced. And when I first came upon it, furniture and toy blocks were strewn inside, resembling the furniture and boxes left by Maurice and Alice. The abandoned dollhouse sticks with me. I imagine there was a child who once staged imaginary domestic routines in each of the tiny rooms. Was the dollhouse a stage for aspirations left unattained? Was the fact that the dollhouse was left behind a sign that Alice's attempt at domestic stability had been in vain? What childhood hopes were abandoned beneath that broken roof? I wanted to know more about the dollhouse. I started by taking it out of the storage bin, removing the scattered furniture, and evicting the spider who had taken up residence. I cleaned, scrubbed, and dusted the dollhouse, but it gave up no further secrets. However, I did realize that I was reenacting the same inspiration that had set my thesis in motion. I was playing house while in real life, facing the task of building a home with someone I loved. This home requires maintenance and tending. It can be both confining and empowering. Beyond our doorstep, I am concerned with occupying a space within a community and recognizing that by moving here, we are perpetuating the trend of gentrification in the city of Seattle. In short, moving into this house has brought up questions of gentrification, gender, ownership, and developing relationships. I am choosing to express these questions through embroidery. I find that working with textiles is uniquely suited to addressing the questions and concerns that have arisen out of moving into this house. In working with fabric, I am able to literally create layers by placing pieces of fabric on top of one another. In using embroidery to create poetry, I am directly engaging with the domestic sphere while simultaneously pushing against it. I've chosen cross-stitch, an easy beginner stitch, to explore questions about playing house and making home. The poems are left purposely unadorned, without images or designs that would be found in more traditional embroidery. The language that I use is frequently plucked out of the domestic sphere, and I I play with words nested within other words to create additional friction and meaning. While these poems are short, they are also dense and presented with plenty of space around them in order to provide room for thought. The end is a collection of minimalist concrete poems that use wordplay and color to evoke meaning. Upon the completion of the project, the embroidered poems will be stored in the dollhouse, and the dollhouse will serve as a unifying bridge between the poetics and the poems. The colonial-style dollhouse, with its white door frame flanked by pillars and topped with a triangular pediment, is emblematic of mid-century America. Replicated in miniature, it speaks to how deeply the colonial mindset is rooted. Even though the house we're living in was lawfully purchased, there was a point in history when the land was stolen from native hands. Regardless of whether or not we were complicit in the first acts of colonizing this land, the fact that we are able to live here is a colonial inheritance. As I am working with fabric and embroidering my poems, it is important for me to recognize that the most elemental choices I am making can push against these patriarchal and colonial ideas. It is not enough to just pick up any fabric from the store. Each fabric has its own history, and a lot of those stories are tied up in a history of colonialism. It is important for me to recognize that many hands from many backgrounds have touched these materials, and their stories are woven into the warp and weft even before I begin stitching. As I step outside and look at our yard, I sometimes imagine what it would be like to conduct an archaeological dig on this site. The top layer of the soil is filled with Legos and Hot Wheels for Marie's and Alice's children, but I can dig further. I imagine what I would find if I dug back to 1923, the year the house was built, or to the 1850s, when this neighborhood was known as Hanford Hill. I find satisfaction in imagining what an excavation might reveal if I dug down past the settlers to a time when the Duwamish referred to this area as greenish-yellow spine because of the deciduous trees that grew on the hill. My imaginary archaeological dig would show that groups of people have been moving in and out of this neighborhood for a long time. Currently, a steady flow of people is migrating to more affordable neighborhoods like Beacon Hill from more expensive areas in Seattle. One of the major conversations concerning gentrification is the way that it whitewashes the history of everything that has come before, and that newcomers enter the neighborhood without a respect for the history of the community. This conversation implicates me on a personal level. What does it mean to be the white couple that moves into a house previously owned by a mixed-race couple? What is our role living in a neighborhood where the population is over 78% non-white? What can we contribute to a community that didn't ask us to move here? I'm not able to excuse myself from the gentrification of Beacon Hill because I have learned that there are things that I can do to be a responsible citizen and a member of this community. For me, it was important to research the land where our house was built. I read about how the population of Beacon Hill has changed over time as different people from different backgrounds have called this area home. I know that reading about history is no substitute for living it, but cultivating an understanding of the area where I now live has made me feel more at home. I also did some digging through King County records and found the plat of the neighborhood. The plat represents the idea of the home where we live and was created before the house was built. Much like an embroidery pattern, the land is divided into squares, and it takes a very strong imagination to envision the color and texture of the final product. It was after looking at this plat for the first time that I began to call the patterns I made for my embroideries maps. I imagine them as aerial views of neighborhoods that spelled the words and phrases of my poems. I have my own aerial view from our attic bedroom where I sometimes work. It overlooks our backyard and surrounding neighborhood. In truth, it was this room that really made Mike and I fall in love with the house. Wood panels run across the ceiling, and something about the way the wood contours to the odd peaks of the roof makes the space feel like a ship. On nice days, sun falls in through the big windows and the wood shines warm and clean. Ascending the stairs is like discovering a secret, and it's my favorite place to curl up at the end of the day with a cat purring next to my head and blankets piled on top of me. Even as I settle into this comfortable domestic space, I can't help but recall the literary trope of the mad woman in the attic, which suggests something sinister about the seclusion of the peak roof. We are familiar with this trope from books like Jane Eyre, in which Rochester keeps his wife, Bertha Mason, locked in the attic. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's story, The Yellow Wallpaper, provides another example. her protagonist, prescribed rest for her depression, takes her to her bedroom in the attic of the house her husband has rented, a respite that ultimately turns into a place of solitary confinement that causes her to become delusional. As I read The Yellow Wallpaper, I couldn't help but compare it to Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. Even though the protagonist in The Yellow Wallpaper technically has a room where she can write, even if she is forced to do so in secret, it is not enough to keep her sane. There is something in this comparison that speaks to the need for a porous dwelling space. In my thesis, I'm working to define a house as a space in which the dwellers are not permanent, but the house and the land serve as hosts to a variety of lives that have lived here before us and will live here after us. I have questions about what it means to occupy this house and land, and about the privilege that comes with living here. However, underlying all of my questions is the idea that I have a large degree of control over when our door is open and when it is closed. I am able to remove myself from distractions when I need to write, but I am also able to open our doors to company. There is nothing inherently confining about the home. It is only when a woman is not able to dictate the terms by which a dwelling space is occupied that we begin to witness violations to her well-being. I feel a sense of comfort and well-being when I surround myself with old photographs, cookbooks, and textiles that have been crocheted or embroidered by my great-aunts and great-grandmothers. If our house is haunted by the past of Maurice and Alice, then these objects that contain pieces of my own family and heritage are like the seeds of a happy home. In addition to the strata of history written in the soil, there are also layers of history and heritage we bring with us. By bonding fabrics with embroidery, I strive to create a visual metaphor for the layers of time while honoring the legacy of the women in my family. The process of embroidery is methodical and slow. It requires that I meditate on the themes of gentrification, domesticity, and ownership as the words in my poems emerge slowly in the fabric. Each stitch is the product of my hands' movement, and in that sense, the themes that I explore are pulled through my body and into the material. As the poems are stitched through me, other questions of my own experience become a part of these poems and textiles. How do I carve out time for myself and my art within a shared space? How do I find the balance between my relationship with Mike and my relationship with myself? This project uses the space of the dollhouse and the labor of handicraft to cultivate both sides of these questions. It is both frustrating and rewarding to recognize that neither of these relationships will ever be complete. The longer Mike and I live in the house, the easier it becomes to set aside time and space to find the balance between cultivating our personal needs and those of our relationship. Ultimately, we're in a really good place. With this sense of stability, we've been able to ask ourselves more often, what is the best use of the space? So far, the answers have been relatively small things. We adopted a cat from a rescue shelter and are opening up our home to guests from out of town. Even though these gestures are small in the grand scheme of things, they spark a discussion of the porousness of our household. What is it we would like to invite into our home? And in the times that we are having these discussions, even though it is not always explicitly stated, the question we're asking is, can we do this and still maintain our balance, both as individuals and as a couple? As we weave, warp, stretch, fold, and ultimately layer our lives, my poems are ultimately about the questions we are unprepared to answer, but have the privilege of being able to ask. Thank you.
You did it.